So shall I just start off with the intro? Do you have anything like, whatever I do with Jenny and Alice, they're always doing these like witty intros.
I find that very offensive that you've just said that to me.
Well, no.
Some of your favourites.
I just meant finding a witty intro important to you.
Okay, good start. Well, what I normally do is I take a coincidentally funny part elsewhere in the episode.
And clip it.
And clip it in, yeah. I don't...
Okay. Oh, yeah, you did that on the last one. It was really good. I remember on the
Thank you, mate.
episode.
Yes, great. Get yourself out of that hole. Jesus
yeah,
Christ.
let me dig myself out a little bit.
You just open with like, oh, actually for me to say, when I record with Jenny and Alice, it's actually better.
Hello, and welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for book lovers. And today, we're even going to go ahead and welcome short story lovers, because Sarah and I are going to be talking about some of our favorite short stories and why we love the form. I'm coming to you from Indianapolis, US of A, and Sarah is coming to you from the Netherlands. How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm doing well. I hate it when the other guys talk about weather, but I'm going to do it today. It actually just snowed here, even though it's spring and it's daylight savings. Yeah, we had some snowfall this week, which was pretty wild. And that was the highlight of my week.
Wow.
How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, but since you and I last talked, I have been sick twice.
Have
I
you?
I got the regular flu, and then I had stomach flu. It was not great. I know. And I was really worried when I had the stomach flu because they're saying that some of these new variants of COVID that are coming out post-Omicron are mainly presenting themselves as gastrointestinal symptoms. And so I was pretty worried that I had COVID at first. But I took several tests and nothing came back positive. So I just had the regular old stomach flu. So yeah, it's not been great. But I'm feeling really good now.
Yeah, you really packed that in. I'm just looking at we only spoke a few weeks ago. You really crammed that in.
Yeah, I know.
That's wild. Yeah, I have a bit of a cold as well, which is not COVID. And I was like, I did a test and it was negative and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's right, colds.
Yeah,
I forgot about those. Haven't had one of those for a few years.
Now that we're opening up a little bit and doing more in the outside world, the other viruses are having a chance to spread again. It's not fun, but. Outside of illnesses and weather, have you been reading anything good?
I have been reading anything good. Yes.
Yeah?
I read Robert Webb's memoir, actually. Do you know who Robert Webb is?
I do not.
He is a British comedian, I guess, kind of a scriptwriter, British comedian. Most people, if you know him, will know him from Peep Show. And it's like him and David Mitchell. I don't know if you know David Mitchell. He's on a lot of panel shows and stuff.
Yeah.
David Mitchell, the comedian, that is, not David Mitchell, the author.
Yes.
So yeah, he and David Mitchell were like writing partners or whatever, like a comedy duo for many years. I think kind of still are. And so he just published a memoir a couple of years ago. And it was just at the library. I just picked it up and read it. It's quite short. I enjoyed it a lot, actually. So it's about him. His mother died when he was a teenager. And so it's about him, this sort of happening to him, going through school. He really wanted to get into Cambridge, but obviously he was basically a mess. So he had to actually do his final year of school twice because he didn't get good enough marks to get into Cambridge, because he really wanted to do script writing and stuff. So he wanted to get into Cambridge Footlights and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was about sort of how he worked through that. I should say what it's called, actually. It's called How Not to Be a Boy. And he's talking about how he was really struggling through losing his mother, and he had his dad and his stepdad. They were all kind of grieving, but they couldn't really talk about it. And he had also older brothers. And he's talking a bit about how male emotions are so sort of suppressed and stuff, and he didn't really know how to express himself, and he wasn't really given any tools to express himself, and he didn't. And his dad and his stepdad obviously knew that he was failing school because he was very sad about the fact that his mother had died, but they didn't really know what to do to sort of help him. They would just sort of awkwardly try and talk to him about it, but it's all very cringy when you read the scenes where his dad's sort of trying to tell him well, mate, happens to the best of us, happens to the, and he talks a lot about especially his dad's generation and how they were kind of brought up about how he was told not to cry and all that kind of stuff. So it's about him working through that. I'm making it sound really sad, but it's not sad because it's a lot about him being an awkward teenager and trying to go on dates and it sort of all going horribly wrong. So there's a lot of sort of cringy coming of age stuff, which, because he's a comedian, he writes it very funnily, so it's quite lighthearted in that way. And it's the timeline is broken up, so you sort of have moments of him when he's lost his mother, and then moments of him like sort of awkwardly trying to kiss people in university and it going like horribly wrong, and he doesn't know what to do and all that kind of stuff. And he's bi as well, so he's sort of working through that in his own way, and that's also sort of hard for him because he doesn't really, again, have the words to express how he feels, and when people ask him, he doesn't really know what to say. So it's a good read, and it's nice. You don't read a lot about bi people, so it was nice to actually read something like explicitly on page where he's talking about this.
How did you feel about the writing? I always kind of wondered with like celebrity memoirs, like how well the writing kind of comes across.
It was okay. Like
Yeah.
3 out of 5. The writing was definitely the weakest part of it. He's quite funny, so I think it would probably be better. Yeah, it's quite witty, and there's obviously quite a few parts where he's trying to make a joke that maybe doesn't come off on page very well. I know Jenny listened to this, and I believe she listened to the audiobook, and she said that was really, really good. So because he reads it himself, so I'm sure if people are interested in reading it, I would probably try the audiobook because I think it would probably come across best then as well, because obviously that's his skill set.
Nice. I actually have finished 2 books in a day. Though, who am I? I'm actually reading again. It's weird. So I finished up a book called Half a Lifelong Romance by Eileen Chang, which is this modern Chinese classic novel. And it's a really interesting book. This was the book club choice for my Genre Raiders book club that I run with Jessica over on YouTube. And it's about it's kind of like if Jane Austen was doing 1930s China, Shanghai.
Okay.
So it's definitely like the first half of it definitely is about like 2 young people falling in love. Both of them have these kind of middle class burdens on them and the expectations that their families have in terms of like what they're wanting for their futures and finding good matches. And so it has that kind of like Austen-y vibe in the first half of the book. But then it really changes in the second half due to a really traumatic event that feels very different from what you're expecting from the setup, which I won't spoil, but like definite trigger warnings for sexual assault. The rest of the book is then like how that event kind of forces everybody to make decisions for themselves that they wouldn't otherwise have done. And you follow this huge like cast of characters that are all kind of swirling around this event from these 2 different families. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. The writing was really fantastic, and I really loved the dialogue. There's this real heightened sense of melodrama. Like there is something about it that really did kind of feel like a soap opera, but not in a bad way. It really kept me engaged and hooked the whole time. And it's a book that like really made me angry because the characters were so frustrating, but in ways that you could understand given the time period and the cultural values at the time. And it really made me interested in looking into like 1930s Shanghai and kind of what was going on there, because I realized that like my understanding of like how society was structured and the World War II era for China is really not there. So I really want to learn more about that after reading that book. So I really enjoyed that. Then another book that was a bit more tepid on that I just finished was Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukafka, which, have you heard of this one?
I think so, but I think it might just literally be from you marking it on Goodreads.
Okay.
And I've just like processed that as like me knowing about it. I don't think I know anything about it.
So this is about a man who is on death row, and you know that he's guilty of being a serial killer, that he killed at least 3 girls, and this is counting down to his execution, the last 12 hours of his life, but it's actually telling the story from the perspective of 3 women in his life. Those women being the mother who abandoned him, his wife's twin sister, who kind of watched on the sidelines as their relationship devolved, and then the final woman is the detective who was hot on his case, who happened to be somebody that he actually knew as a child. And so every chapter, the way the book is structured is that you'll get a chapter from a woman from his life going over the past, his story, and then you'll get a chapter of him in prison awaiting the execution. A chapter from a woman, chapter of him awaiting execution. So there's this real kind of countdown to doomsday for him as you're kind of reading the book and learning about his story. And it's a really interesting look at like the people around a serial killer, kind of debunking this like myth that there is, especially with this kind of true crime stuff that like inside the mind of a serial killer is this kind of brilliant insanity, when in reality it's actually this really rather uninteresting, boring killer. Like, there's not the, I'm trying to say, like, the society has almost created this like mythos around him. And there's this really interesting like scene when the detective finally gets him in an interrogation room, and she's so disappointed by the interrogation because, she's never had a serial killer case before. And she has kind of internalized some of these like dramas and stuff like that from true crime, what she's seen on television. And then like the reality is just this boring man who's violent in all of the same ways that she's seen violent men over and over again in her career. And so it was a really interesting look at that. The writing in that book, though, however, it struggles sometimes. I found it overwrought, and there's some metaphors that are just really stretched. Like at one point, she says that there's a few lines. Like at one point, a woman is seeing this waitress, and she says the waitress looks like a poem, and you're like, what's that even mean? Or like, at one point, like she says that like grief was lonely like a planet, and it was just stuff like that. It was very contrived metaphors over and over again. So yeah, I was kind of bummed out by the fact that if it had just really gone with a little bit more straightforward writing style, I think I would have enjoyed it a little bit more. But yeah.
Question. So was it sort of making the case in terms of what it was saying about how we socially treat serial killers? Because they are kind of, I don't even want to use that word fetishize, because I think that's too strong a word, but there is that kind of fixation on people who do like elaborate murders. Was it kind of making the case that we fixate on these people too much, or that they're really boring? Or
a little bit. I think it was more trying to look at whether or not there's really anything to be gained from trying to delve into the psychosis of violent men. Like, is it even a worthwhile exercise? Yeah. Because something that's happening in this book as well is that he has this like grand theory. He was like a philosophy student that ended up not graduating college, and he has this like grand theory of morality that he thinks is like really profound. But the more you probe it and the more you learn about it, like, he's just saying that all people have good in them and all people have bad in them. Like, there's nothing actually there, but he's convinced of his own genius and his need to like get this theory out there when it's saying nothing. And so there is quite a bit of that where, he has kind of like internalized this kind of, genius.
Interesting. I don't know if you've read The Five by Hallie Rubenfeld.
No, but I've heard really good things.
I'm so sorry to long-term listeners of this podcast, because we have brought this book up. I don't know. They're like, fucking hell, if I had $1.
Yeah.
It's about the 5 women that were presumably killed by Jack the Ripper. Of course, no one really knows if he was the same person or any of that kind of stuff. And she is a historian, and she is outlining these 5 women and what we know about their lives, what their lives probably were. She does a bit of like sort of narrative nonfiction and fills in what we don't know about them, using her sort of knowledge as a historian. And in that book, she has a really, really interesting essay at the end, which kind of changed my whole perception on this, actually, because she talks a lot about this exact thing, being interested in serial killers, like true crime podcasts and all that kind of stuff. And when I read this book, I actually stopped listening to all of them because I started to feel really weird about it, that for this exact reason. She was saying, like, sometimes there's this perception that people, like the Golden State Killer, for example, are these kind of like geniuses, and these are actually just like really sick men who, for the most part, obviously not always, but generally just really sick men who have killed a lot of women, and
for the most part have gotten lucky.
Yeah.
Like, most of these strings of serial killers, it's not because they're like geniuses at hiding the crime. Like, they've largely gotten lucky, and they've largely, and I hate to say this, but they've picked victims who they know there won't be a ton of investigation into. I mean, that's how a lot of them get away with it. It's not actually like they're geniuses, they're just taking advantage of gaps in the justice system.
Yeah, exactly. And shows like Dexter and stuff, I started to become a bit uncomfortable with them, actually, because it's sort of, and yeah, she talks a bit about like the importance of being victim focused.
Have you read After the Eclipse by Sarah Perry?
No.
It's the American Sarah Perry, not the British Sarah Perry that wrote Melmoth and the Ethic Serpent.
Okay, I've never read anything by the American one.
So this was her first book, and Sarah Perry's mother was murdered while Sarah Perry was in the house, and she could hear her mom being killed.
Oh, God.
So it was devastating. She was only 11 years old, and she ended up being the one that phoned the police.
Oh, my God.
And the book is a look at her mother's life and the crime, but it's more about like what ended up happening to her after her mother was killed, and it's a real examination of like true crime. And this was the book that had the same impact on me and my relationship to true crime that you're describing what The Five did for you, because she was talking about how like in certain television shows and stuff like that covered her mom's murder, and all of them boiled down her mom's entire life to these last violent seconds, that it didn't encapsulate the person she was, focused entirely too much on the killer himself and all this different stuff. And so the book that Sarah Perry is presenting is not who killed my mother, here's the investigation. Like, that's not the focus. It's rather like, this is my mother's life, and this is how we should reclaim what true crime has done to our minds when it comes to the way that we conceptualize these crimes and our relationships to them. And it's a really brilliant book, and this is kind of doing some similar stuff in this one as well.
That sounds really good. What's it called?
It is called After the Eclipse.
I'm going to look it up.
Yeah,
that sounds really good.
Book. And it's beautifully written, so another plus.
Yeah, I think it's a really important conversation, actually, because it really has become, it's just everywhere.
Huge.
A little bit uncritically, in my opinion, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and there hasn't been a lot of examinations from like think pieces and stuff like that about like what is the current true crime media landscape doing, you know? So there was a recent back in 2015, I think it was. There was a very high profile murder near where I lived called the Delphi Murders. It was about two young girls who were killed, and there was a podcast that covered this from CNN. Backed it and produced it, and it's a very well produced podcast, and I was really hoping when I listened to it that like it would be something interesting about like, you know, this town, this very small town where this happened, kind of a look at these people's lives, especially because I was familiar with the area and the types of people that would be there and what that community looked like. And I listened to the podcast, and it was just the most standard fare true crime podcast you've ever heard, offered no new information, just recounted all the grisly details for the salaciousness of it. And that for me was like my final, I'm done with true crime. Like it was the final straw for me, where I was just like, this is, you know, especially because this was a case that I was so familiar with, and these families were people I had seen on the news over and over again, like seeing this exploitation over again, it was like, I'm done.
Yep. Yeah, you got that. Will I ask you that second question? I was going to ask you about Death Row, what the book's view of Death Row, if they were like pushing a Death Row narrative, but
it wasn't really pushing a narrative. It definitely like I'm very anti-death row. Like even in cases like this where like somebody's clearly guilty and like sick and twisted, like I just don't think, I don't know, I can't ever get behind it, you know. And this book definitely does, even though it's presenting a very unsympathetic look at this man and his pathetic existence. There's a point in it when he's like 16 minutes to death, and he's looking at the chaplain, and he's like, how can they let this happen? And like he's genuinely confused. And that, for me, actually, I found really hard to read, because it's like, if you think that like death is wrong, if you think murder is wrong, like how can you let this happen? Like, you know, and it really did get me, as much as I really didn't like the guy, obviously.
Yeah.
But I'm also somebody who's primed to have that reaction because I'm so anti-death row.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I sort of learned in university, I did a bit of law, and I studied like psychology of law a little bit, and we would learn about the problem. Yeah, essentially what our lecturer laid out for us, his opinion was that, which I agree with, is that even if you are pro death row and you think it's a good idea, you have to accept that not everyone who gets convicted on death row will be guilty. That is just like part of the way the justice system works. It's not possible to have 100% of the people who will. So you will kill an innocent person sooner or later. And this is, so if you're accepting death row as a good idea, then you have to also accept that you're going to kill innocent people. So he opined that was a too high a price to pay, even if you did theoretically believe that sort of very biblical eye for an eye sort of view of the world, which I thought was an excellent. So yeah, I was already anti-death row. I mean, we don't have it in Australia. Yeah, I thought that was an excellent point. Right. Anyway, let's move on from death row.
Very deep conversation here.
Very. What was my my current read is called Dead Mountain by Donnie Icar, which is a non-fiction book written by a journalist about a case of a group of hikers going missing in Russia and
Wow.
being killed.
Oh my.
We're in interesting territory today, my friend.
A bit morbid.
Okay, so it's about the Dyatlov incident, which happened in Russia in 1959, in which a group of student hikers went hiking on quite a big hiking trip in the middle of winter, so deep snow, and they all died under very mysterious circumstances. So they all went out hiking. They were all quite experienced. They were actually doing it for some kind of badge or something that you would have to earn. They were all in like hiking clubs, so they were doing it for a very particular reason, and they took it very seriously. And there was quite a lot of them, I think, maybe 9 or 10. And they went out onto this hike to this mountain, and then they didn't come back. And when a search party eventually went out to look for them, they were all found very far away from each other. One of them was 1,000 yards away from the other, for example. A lot of them weren't wearing any clothes. None of them were wearing shoes. They all had quite high amounts of radiation in their bodies. Most of them didn't die from exposure. One of them had a blunt force head trauma, and another one of them was missing their tongue.
What?
Yeah, this is a true story. I'll put a link to the Wikipedia page about the incident in the show notes for people who want to have a quick look.
Wow.
And this book is a non-fiction book written by an American journalist who has gone to Russia to try and figure out what happened, and he's trying to piece together what the hell happened, because it's just a really, really weird story.
That sounds fascinating. That is bizarre.
Really interesting, and it's quite... So 1959 is when it happened. So he's also, at the moment, he's just sort of, I'm about halfway through the book. So he's actually gone to the place where it is, and he's trying to, I think this book was only published a couple of years ago. So unfortunately, because like so long has passed since it actually happened, unfortunately, most of the people who would know about it have actually passed away. And he's trying to, piece all this together. But he's also setting quite a lot of context for what it was like to be a student in this time. So this is like the post-Stalin era, what it's like to be in the Soviet Union in the 50s, how that actually was. And there's quite a lot of stuff about how the students were, which I didn't really know at all about, how the students were really excited because they were able to go to other parts of their own country for the first time, which I didn't realize that was quite a restriction during Stalin's reign, I guess. So yeah, it's really, really interesting. I hope that he actually finds some stuff, because a couple of things that I've read, this kind of stuff where there's like a big mystery, they don't actually figure it out in the end, which is always a bit anticlimactic. So I hope you can find something out. But
I've never heard of this book. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah, the writing is pretty serviceable, as you would say.
Yes,
it's pretty good. Certainly, the mystery is carrying it more for me than the writing itself. But
that sounds very fascinating.
Yeah, fun bit of nonfiction.
This is where we take a little break to tell you about all the different ways you can support the podcast, some of which are totally free. A really effective and super easy way of showing your support is by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. There is a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the Apple Podcast page where you can write a review. And if you listen on Spotify, you can now very easily give us a star rating. You can also share our posts on social media. We are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter. You can sign up to our free monthly newsletter where we share even more book recommendations and the latest podcast news. But the best way for us to find new listeners is by you telling your book-loving friends and family about us. If you want to support the podcast financially, we do have a Patreon account. You can sign up for as little as £2 a month. We offer early access to the podcast, monthly bonus episodes, and our top tier will get you all of the above and personalized book recommendations. We get you to fill in a survey, and then we tailor our book recommendations to your preferences. We will also send you books in the post. The link will be in our show notes. But however you choose to support, we, as always, want to say a huge thank you. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners. Shall we talk about some short stories?
Let's.
I love short stories. I actually am always frustrated when I don't read short stories throughout the month. It's like a part of my reading diet that I feel like I have to have some input, at least like a little bit a month. And sometimes I don't even read like whole short story collections. I just like read different like science fiction and fantasy magazines that are publishing short stories and stuff like that.
Do you really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of different ones, and just kind of like read one-off stories, because it's nice sometimes when like you realize that you want to read something, but I don't know, maybe none of the novels are speaking to you, or you don't have time to like sit and read like a really long chapter, but like there's a 10-page short story you can plow through. It's really nice to have that.
I am not a very big fan of a standalone short story,
Okay.
but I am a very, very big fan of an interconnected short story collection.
Okay.
Very much. I love. Yeah, I think I've got a number of recommendations that we're about to talk about, and I think every single one of them is such a thing, an interconnected short story collection.
Okay.
So that's really like completely my vibe. I do quite like short stories. I must say there are quite a few authors. When I read their work, I think, you know what, this could have been a very good short story, and not so much a novel.
I think it's actually a very different, writing muscle. I'm
I think
not
so
a
too,
writer
totally
myself,
different.
so I can't say, but like there's plenty of novelists who I love, and then I read their short stories and I'm like, do not like this. And there's plenty of people whose short stories I really like, and then I go on to read their novels and I'm like, nope. Sarah Hall is a really good example of that. Like, I mean, she's a critically acclaimed novelist. Plenty of people love her, so I'm not saying she's a bad novelist. But for me personally, I don't love her novels, but I love her short stories.
Okay.
So, like, it's, you know, somebody can be really good at one thing for you and not necessarily good at the other, because I really do think it's a very different set of skills that's required. I think what I love about short stories and what they can do that's so different is that they can be very experimental, they can be very weird, they can do things that would try the patience of a reader if it was sustained over the course of a novel.
For sure.
You know, like one of the stories I'm going to talk about has this almost like listy kind of format to it, that if a whole novel was written like that, you would like lose your mind. But when it's condensed into this short story that packs a punch, maybe just has one moment of character development or one kind of thematic note, it can really like go to the core of something.
I agree. I also really I think they're a very good way to explore a single idea that maybe wouldn't flesh out so well into a novel without introducing like a lot of other stuff into the novel, right?
Yes.
Like other characters, other conflicts,
Yes.
whatever. Some of the best short stories I've read have been like moments of loss, for example, or, you know, total joy or something like that, where you just get this brilliant picture of a person's life without this whole backstory.
Yes.
That's why I like them.
And that's very true. Like you just said about like it allows you to introduce one thing that like would not work over the course of a novel. Like I just got done reading a short story. I think it was called The Alchemist's Gate or something like that. It's by Ted Chang. We'll put it in the show notes. But in that story, it's a time travel story. And it presents this idea of time travel where you have like one door that you can go into the past however many years you want, and come out that exact same door. And you know going into it that you can't like change the past at all. And it presents different people that have gone in and out of this door. And it's a really beautiful story. But I don't like time travel novels because they introduce too many different questions for me. And like, if you try and flesh out those plots too much, it eventually gets into this weird question that I just can't get past of like, what came first? And it breaks my brain a little bit. But as just like a singular short story, it allowed me to like experience time travel without introducing all these other like kind of overwhelming questions about the theme. The other thing I think is really cool about short stories is that I think that it's where most of the kind of experimentation is happening inside of a genre. Something like that gets said a lot of times is that people write novels for the general reading public, and that writers write short stories for other writers, because most of the people that are like reading these short stories tend to be total nerds like Sarah and I, or
Speak for yourself.
or writers. And so because of that, I think people are more willing to take these kind of risks that they wouldn't take with a novel. And then like it's you know, like in science how like smaller organisms evolve and change faster. I feel like the same thing happens in short stories where like they like evolve and change faster as well, like the trends and stuff like that. So they're really fun to trace. So what I thought Sarah and I would do today is talk about some of our favorite short stories and recommend some to you guys. So do you want to go first, Sarah?
No, because I have fewer than you. Are we going to alternate?
Yeah, that sounds good. The first story I wanted to talk about is one called After We Walk Away by Erica L. Satifka. This is published in Apex magazine. And I heard about this story because a little bit ago there was kind of some discourse going on SFF Twitter about The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. Have you read this, Sarah?
Could I just interrupt you, Chris?
Yes.
For the listeners, what is SFF Twitter? I can't even say it. What is it? Is it SSF or SFF?
SFF. Science
SFF.
fiction and fantasy Twitter. So people that are obsessed with the genre. So yeah, so have you read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin?
No.
So it was probably one of her most popular short stories. And in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, it presents to the reader a description of this utopia called Omelas. She invites the reader to really picture any happiness or sense of joy that you would derive from a utopia and imagine it in Omelas. All of the beauty, all of the joy, technological plenty, all of this different stuff. Beaming with happiness. And after she gets done describing this, she says to the reader, "Do you believe it? If not, let me tell you one more thing." And she goes on to describe how in a dark basement in Omelas, there is a child who suffers and is abused and tortured, and all this horrible stuff happens to him. And that there is a coming-of-age ceremony in Omelas in which the children are invited to look at this child and learn that all of their happiness, all of their joy, all of their plenty is because he suffers. And she's very explicit about the fact that if not for the suffering of this child, the utopia could not exist. And that what happens is that people who cannot live with this reality leave Omelas and they walk away, which is why it's called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And so the story is been blown up. It's taught in a lot of high schools, and it's inspired a lot of responses. Many of the responses, I think, are really lackluster. And so I had put out in a little tweet, has there ever been a good response story to The Ones Who Walk Away? Because most of them suck, including the N.K. Jemisin story. I'm not a fan of it. And so
I love that you just managed to fit that in there.
Erica Satifka was somebody I had interacted with on Twitter, and she responded, was I wrote a response story to Omelas, and obviously I think it's good. And I read it, and I totally agree. It totally rips. It's one of the best responses to The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And what it's about is it's about two people who leave Omelas, and it's about them trying to survive in the wider world. And it opens up with basically them saying they regretted their decision by the time they arrived in Iowa. And it goes on to really delve into the psychology of somebody who was so repulsed by this injustice that they leave, but find themselves in a world where thousands of children suffer and nothing good comes of it. There is no utopia because of the suffering. There is no happiness because of the suffering. And it's a really deep dive into the psychosis of that decision. And it goes into some pretty dark and twisted places as one of the characters tries desperately to re-find that happiness. And it's really brilliant.
Is it very dark? It sounds very dark.
I would say the ending got very dark. The ending went to a place I did not expect, but the best ending I've read. It totally made sense. So I was this... It had this kind of conclusion that when you read it, it was shocking. And then you realized from the onset and the premise, it was inevitable. And so it was so good. It was really a great response, because I think a lot of times the responses to The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, they try and be won't someone rescue the child? Won't someone do this? And that tends to be this kind of, kind of elementary response to the story, because Ursula Le Guin's very specific that if not for the suffering of the child, this utopia could not exist. You cannot have the happiness without the suffering of the child. And that's the thought experiment she's presenting to the reader.
So presumably you have to read the Le Guin in order to read this,
Yes.
would you say?
I would say yes, but the Le Guin story is very short. It's a 10-minute read max.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've heard a lot about that story, but I've never read it. Oh, it sounds interesting. So my first recommendation is All the Acorns on the Forest Floor by Kim Hooper, which I read this year. I think I talked about this a little bit on the podcast with you, actually, Chris. Do you remember
believe
this?
so, but I think it might have been a Patreon episode.
Well, please join our Patreon if you would like to hear it. I'm sure it was a wonderful episode. Brilliant set of interconnected short stories. Hello. It's mostly following women who are mostly trying to be mothers, and it's about parenthood, the complexities of parenthood, how this can be actually not the greatest time for people, how this is such a heavy decision, how the pressures about being a parent, how that can affect you, and how you can feel if you feel that you're not performing well as a parent, or if you feel that you shouldn't be a parent or can't be a parent, and how that makes you feel, especially from the perspective of women, although not always. And the reason why I love this short story collection so much is that every single short story follows a generally woman who is generally trying to be a mother or thinking about being a mother, and they will have an interaction with someone which they get the sort of the wrong end of the stick of or from, and then in the next short story it will go to that person and you hear from their life and why they treated her like this. So like probably the best example I think I can think of from the book is one where there is a woman who is giving birth, and so she goes into hospital to actually she's in labor, and one of the midwives is really rude to her, and she's really annoyed at this midwife, and she's like, I can't believe she would be so rude, this is the most important day of my life. And then the next chapter it goes to the midwife's perspective, and then it turns out that the midwife has been desperately trying to have a child for years and years and years, and she's lost many of them, and her partner has tried to get her to leave many times, but she won't, and so it's sort of like a really difficult situation from her. And it was just such a brilliant examination of how every person that you meet has got their own unique story about this sort of thing that we all have parents, and many people are parents, how it kind of connects you, but you can never understand the complexities of someone's relationship with their parents, and how you can just completely misunderstand why someone has spoken to you the way they have, or why they believe something. I thought it was just brilliant. Really loved it.
Yeah, I want to read this really, really bad. Ever since you mentioned it to me the first time, I've been trying to get it. It just sounds brilliant. And I love that topic of parents and all the different, like, ways people get there. And, like, that's a relationship that, like even with the people with the best relationships with their parents and stuff like that, it's a relationship that everyone has baggage with. Like, because...
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe this is a bit weird, but I think of like kind of coming of age as kind of like this inherently kind of traumatic experience, and not necessarily in like the worst way, but like you have that with your parents. Like there's some baggage there that you're carrying, and also they're carrying with the way they became parents and all that different stuff.
I think even if nothing awful has happened with your family and you've got a sort of a very stable family or whatever, there's still so much change in what we think is okay, like from generation to generation, right? So everyone just has this. I think especially if you are a parent, and then your parents, what they think of the way that you might parent is just completely different, and there's a lot of like guilt and stuff. So
yeah, exactly.
I mean, interesting.
My mother started having kids when she was 19, and like it was still a little bit young at the time, but pretty common. It wasn't like she was considered unusual, and nowadays I would probably be considered extremely unusual to know someone who was 19 and having children. So there's so many different changing expectations with childhood.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
parenthood.
Even that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The next one is a story that I really can't talk a whole lot about because it's a very short story, and I don't want to give away the ending. It's a story that really packs a punch. It's a pretty famous one called If You Were a Dinosaur, My Love by Rachel Swirsky. This was published, I think, like back in 2013. It ended up winning the Nebula Award in 2014 for Best Short Story. And it kind of had a huge conversation around it because it was one of the targets of what was called the Sad Puppies, which was a voting block for the Hugos, which is an award for science fiction and fantasy. It was this alt-right backlash against what they felt was liberals taking over science fiction and fantasy. And this was one of the stories that they held up as like being a bad story that was only elevated because of its liberal politics. Totally disagree, obviously. I think it's a fantastic story, and I think it's wonderfully written, and everyone should read it. And it's a story that opens up with the question, if you were a dinosaur, my love. And it is an epistolary story to the narrator's lover, and she describes all of the consequences of how their story would have changed if he had been a dinosaur. And it opens up with, if you were a dinosaur, my love, here's all these things will happen. And then the next paragraph postulates another if question. If this had been different, if this had been different. And you're reading it wondering where all of this is leading, what has caused the narrator to posit this question to their lover, and then it builds to a final devastating paragraph that lays bare why these questions are being asked. And it's a story that I return to all the time because I think it's so beautifully written, and there's so many metaphors, just gorgeous sentences. It's a story I cannot read without crying. I have read this story at least 10 times, and I still tear up when I read it because it's just
God.
hauntingly beautiful.
Oh, I want to read this. This sounds really cool.
It's fantastic. It's published online, very quick read, extremely rewarding.
Love it. That sounds really great. I love just a tiny comment about that, the Hugo Award thing. Like, I love people getting so defensive about older science fiction as if it's like good. It's pretty bad.
There's a lot of it that's not. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not saying that, Frank Herbert didn't pave the way for us all. Well done. My next one is another short story collection called Storyland by Catherine McKinnon. This is an Australian short story collection which I read many years ago, and is set on this. It's kind of a David Mitchell style in that each short story is a kind of jumping forward in time, but it's set in the same spot of land, and each story is sort of 50 to 100 years apart. So it starts off with, I think the first chapter is there are indigenous people living on the land, and then it goes into like Europeans settling, Europeans killing all of the indigenous people, and then it goes into like the sort of modern day Australia, and then it goes into the future when there's like a lot of climate change. And I just loved it. I found it really, really interesting. It was the first book that I'd read that was kind of exploring this idea of how people are connected through like not time and space because it's the same spot, but through time. And I really, really loved it. I thought it was super. Beautiful cover.
It sounds really, really good. Ooh, that is a gorgeous cover.
I think it's one of my favorite covers ever.
Wow, I must read that. And where was this published? Was this Australian?
This is Australian. I imagine. Yeah. I should have done this earlier. Sorry. Let me have a quick look. I imagine it's horrifically hard to get if you're outside of Australia. We'll try and find it on like bookshop.org or something, and leave a link in the show notes.
So the next story I had to talk about is one that if you just want something which is just hilarious and puts you in this really funny joyride, it is really great. It's definitely not as serious as the other stories that I'm mentioning. And it's called Off by Aimee Bender. It's captured in her collection Willful Creatures, but it is available online. And it's about a woman who is like a narcissist and clearly unstable, and she is at a party where she has the goal of kissing a blonde, a brunette, and a redhead. And she will do anything to accomplish this goal and get her what she calls a Neapolitan ice cream. But the whole story is her like offering her perspective on these different people at the party who are all doing like very normal things, and she keeps ascribing to them like the most rancid of motivations for doing the most benign things. And it's clearly obvious that like she is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs on this mission, and being in her like point of view while she's going through this party trying to kiss these men is hilarious. I have never laughed out loud so hard at a short story. And I think it's a really kind of fun one to introduce people to Aimee Bender, because this is just Aimee Bender's style. Like, she writes these bizarre, off-the-wall stories that you just never know where they're going to take you. And they're so imaginative and funny and completely take you out of this real experience. And it's just great.
That sounds funny. Is that a thing? I've never heard of that before.
What?
Targeting different people with different hair colors.
Oh no, it's definitely not a thing. Like, this woman she is crazy. She is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. She is not normal.
I love that politically correct terminology you're using.
Oh yeah, I probably shouldn't. You're right.
Sorry, that sounds funny.
Yeah, she is a wild person to read from. The next one is from one of my absolute favorite short story writers, and that's Jhumpa Lahiri. And it's called Nobody's Business. This is one that I think was published in the New Yorker, so you can find it online, but I read it in her collection Unaccustomed Earth. And it's about two people, a man and a woman. The woman comes from an immigrant family from India that immigrated, I think, in the 70s, which is a very common theme with Jhumpa Lahiri stories. She really has a thing about telling the story of people who immigrated to the United States from India in the 70s, and this kind of conflict between assimilation, East meets West kind of thing. And in this story, they're not friends when they become roommates or anything like that. Like, they're roommates by convenience. And she starts getting all these phone calls. Some of them are from suitors. Some of them are from her boyfriend. And oftentimes he's picking up the phone and dealing with these people. And one day he picks up the phone from a woman who claims to be a lover of his roommate's boyfriend. And it really entangles him in her life and puts him in this really uncomfortable situation where he doesn't know what to do with this information. And the story is really about the tension that exists between people who are living together and sharing all these, intimate parts of their lives simply by the fact that they have to exist in the same space, but who are not intimate with each other and don't have that type of intimate relationship, and this really strange conflict that arises because of it. And the story just gets really, really good and really interesting. And Jhumpa Lahiri's writing style is just fantastic. I think if you like people like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I think you would really like Jhumpa Lahiri. Her writing style really reminds me of that, where it's very descriptive, but also very intimate and character focused. And also something I hear from people who don't like short stories is that they think short stories are too short. Jhumpa Lahiri's stories tend to be a little bit longer, like they tend to be in the 40 to 50 page range.
Oh, okay. It's like a novella almost.
Yeah, so I think that this is a good one to kind of go with because you get quite a bit of meat in one story.
That's interesting. I really like Chimamanda. I'm on a first name basis with her because I have met her, of course. She was lovely.
Oh, did you really meet her?
Yeah, I really have. I really.
Oh, wow,
her.
That's fantastic.
I wouldn't bold-faced lie. I guess it could be a joke.
I guess. I thought you at first you were just joking a little bit. No, that's awesome.
Yeah, I met her just before the pandemic. What was I saying? I do like her, but I did read Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri this year. I think we've talked about this already, actually, and I really didn't get along with it. But then you said to me you should, because that's one of her novels. You said to me you should read her short stories.
Yeah, I didn't. I read a novel by her this year as well, and it was fine. I gave it 3 stars, but it was not nearly as good as her short stories for me.
Yeah, okay. I found it a bit boring. It was like interesting idea, but too long. Like it was very short, but it was still felt too long. So yeah, it kind of stacks up that then her short stories would be quite good.
Yeah, they're very good.
Yeah, nice. Can I talk about David Mitchell now?
Absolutely.
Are you a David Mitchell fan?
No. I've only tried one book, and it was Cloud Atlas. And I have tried that book many a times, and I think I'm too dumb for it.
Yeah, sounds like it. No, I'm just joking. I'm just joking.
I make it like 100 pages. I think it's complicated. I have a hard time with it.
I love David Mitchell. He's one of my favorite writers, and he is a very popular short story writer. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna corner you into just get you to agree to increasingly bold statements until you're like, I love David Mitchell. So he does this incredible thing, which I think has influenced a lot of short story writers, where he will write a bunch of short stories that are interconnected. So kind of in the way of Kim Hooper that I was talking about earlier, and also a little bit like Catherine McKinnon, but it tends to be a little bit more abstract in the way that they're connected. It's not super clear. So like in the Kim Hooper one, the one that I was talking about earlier about motherhood, you really know how these people are connected. Like you don't have to think too hard about it at all. And in David Mitchell's, they're a little bit more... it's just a little bit more abstract in the way that they're actually connected. And also he changes styles quite a lot between stories and between books and that kind of stuff. And I absolutely love his stuff. One of my favorite books is The Bone Clocks by him, which just, as a reader, it really changed me actually, because I just loved the way that he was looking at how, so The Bone Clocks follows a woman named Holly, but you don't actually hear from Holly ever. You hear from all these people who know Holly. So every short story, I think her name's Holly, but if it's not, I apologize. So every short story is set from the perspective of someone who knows her, but they're not interacting with her. They're just someone who happens to know her. So they just have their little short story, which is about, their marriage or whatever. And then you just get this little glimpse of Holly because she might come over for drinks or something like that. And so you follow her through her life, because it starts off when she's a child, all the way through. And it's just this incredible, I found it just an incredible way to follow someone's life like that through the people that know them. And some of them knew her very well. Some of them are colleagues. Some of them barely knew her. And so you just sort of see how different people have this perspective of her, how they know different things about her. You have to kind of piece together what is actually going on with her, because you never hear from her. And I just thought it was such a fascinating idea, a fascinating concept. I was really, I also feel like I did not understand a lot of what was in the Bone Clocks because he writes very sort of abstract, big brain stuff. So I definitely, probably if I read it again, would get a lot more out of it and still wouldn't understand it all. But I just really, really love his short stories. If people are a little bit, I wouldn't use the word intimidated, but if you're a little bit like, oh, not sure about David Mitchell, the book that I recommend for sure is Slade House by him, which is certainly in his sort of signature David Mitchell style, but it's a little bit less abstract, it's a little bit less odd, and it's a sort of really fun haunted house story. So the thing that's connecting all the people in the short stories is this house called Slade House in which people actually go missing. So you go into the house and you never come out again. And it's about what's happening in the house, but you jump through time and as you always do with his stuff. So that's a little bit more linear and gets you a bit more into like what he's trying to do in his style, I think, compared to like Cloud Atlas, which probably I don't think is a great one to start off with, to be honest, because you have to sort of, he just has this, very different way of thinking, I think.
The Cloud Atlas one, I guess like the part where I kept getting stuck at was there's a character who's like on an expedition in like the 1800s, and his perspective, the writing style in it, I found so challenging. Like I was like, am I an idiot? Like I'm reading these sentences and like I feel like I know what the words mean and the sentences are not making sense to me. Like I kept having to like read it over and over again. And yeah, I think that's where I just kept getting stuck. Like that's what I mean where I said like I think I'm too dumb for David Mitchell. Like it's not bad like at all. Like it's brilliant actually, but I need to maybe wait till I like go. Maybe I'll go on like vacation at some point and like have like very clear evenings, no stress. Like all my brain power can be on David Mitchell.
Yeah, it's like I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, I remember reading that bit and it was very easy. It was hard. Like there are bits of Cloud Atlas that are hard. But I think for me, just the main takeaway I get from it is just like he's just such an incredible writer. The way that he can manipulate his prose and stuff to suit exactly what he's trying to do. There's a part of Cloud Atlas which is set from the perspective of a robot, so some sort of like AI robot, and the prose changes so dramatically, and the way that the robot like assesses life is just really good. But yeah, I definitely recommend Slade House over any of his others for to try and see if you like David Mitchell. It's also a lot shorter. It's like a short book.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I have Cloud Atlas and Bone Clocks up there. Can you see them? They're over there.
Yeah.
So I do have them on my shelves. Like I do plan on getting to them at some point. But
I think read Slade House. I think, and if you like it, then try. And if you don't, then don't. For sure. Bone Clocks is like also a mindfuck. I didn't really go into it in too much detail, but it's a real mindfuck. The
Bone Clocks like cover is like stunningly beautiful.
Yeah.
The UK one with the apple, like it's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The Bone Clocks is quite fantastical, actually.
Mm.
It's really like I did not understand the fantastical elements. I was like, is this real? Is this a metaphor? Is this like time? I don't understand. Is this a metaphor for time? Is this a metaphor for aging? I don't know what's happening. He's a wild guy.
All right, so those are some of the short stories and short story collections that Sarah and I recommend. So go forth and read short stories. I'll find lots of people who don't like them, and I'm convinced that people who don't like short stories are only saying that because they're doing it wrong. Go read short stories. There's one out there for you, and it will hook you on the form, and you will never be the same.
Yeah, I think they're super. And if you have a short story collection or individual short story that you think we might like, please let us know what they are.
Absolutely.
So I would love to hear them.
Always looking for recommendations.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, we would really appreciate it if you would leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts to help other people find us. You can contact us with any episode ideas or questions or feedback or whatever at thebookcastclub@outlook.com. If you'd like to contact us on social media, we are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter. But most of all, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you guys. Well, we won't see you at all. We will talk at you in a few weeks. Bye.